When I was barely old enough to remember their faces, my parents died in a car accident. Before their tragic end, they had shown tremendous kindness to the Morrison family during their darkest hour. Perhaps from guilt, or maybe genuine compassion, the Morrisons took me in and brought me to their farm in the remote countryside. Under Mr. and Mrs. Morrison's watchful eyes, I eventually married their eldest son, David Morrison, the boy who had been my childhood companion. What I didn't realize was that his heart already belonged to someone else. After our wedding, David refused any intimacy with me, yet allowed everyone to believe I was the barren one. His parents blamed me relentlessly for our childless marriage, while simultaneously bringing home 2 infants from distant relatives and demanding I raise them as my own. Meanwhile, David enlisted in the military and vanished from our lives, returning maybe once every 12 months. For 18 grueling years, I poured my soul into raising those children until they blossomed into accomplished young adults, both earning acceptance to prestigious Wellington University. That's when David returned, but not alone. He brought her. The woman who had owned his heart all along. At the celebration dinner, in front of our entire community, he announced that those 2 children I had sacrificed everything for were actually his biological offspring with this other woman. I watched them stand together, David, his mistress, the children, and his parents, forming a perfect, radiant family portrait. Only then did the devastating truth hit me: I had been the only one living in ignorance all these years. Shattered beyond repair, I fled into the darkness. In my despair, I stumbled and plummeted off a steep cliff. When consciousness returned, I found myself back at the beginning, the first year of my doomed marriage. David's mother sat rigidly in our family room while his father puffed on his weathered pipe. The cramped space overflowed with distant relatives. Everyone except David's parents and David himself, who cradled 2 small infants, kept stealing glances in my direction. I stood frozen in the doorway as Mrs. Morrison cleared her throat pointedly. "Sarah, perfect timing. These babies belong to Cousin Ruth from Pine Ridge Valley. She just gave birth to her 5th child and heard about your difficulties conceiving. She's offered to let you raise this one." My eyes swept across the room and landed on Rebecca Stone, who had somehow blended seamlessly into the crowd, gazing lovingly at the child in David's arms. So even back then, Rebecca had already infiltrated my life from the shadows. Everyone waited for my response, but Mrs. Morrison's expression radiated confidence, as if my acceptance was inevitable. After all, she had spent the entire past year interrogating me about my failure as a wife, her questions slowly draining the color from my face with shame. I turned to David. "Do you want to raise them?" He responded without hesitation, as if he'd rehearsed this moment. "That's women's work. If you want them, I won't object." "Fine. Then I don't want them. But since you seem so eager, you better give them your complete attention. Don't waste their birth parents' generous gesture." "What did you just say?" David stared at me in complete shock. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the whispered conversations died instantly. I replied with calculated calm, "I'm only 19 years old. There's no medical proof I can't conceive. Why should I raise someone else's children?" David's eyes blazed with disapproval. "How can you be so heartless? Cousin Ruth meant well. I never expected you to be this selfish." I shot back, "Didn't you just say this was none of your concern? So why are you so upset now that I've declined?" David's mouth fell open, as if he couldn't comprehend my defiance. Mrs. Morrison quickly intervened. "Don't say things you'll regret later, Sarah. I know you care for those children. If you want to raise them, I'll provide support." Mr. Morrison removed his pipe and added decisively, "If we're taking them in, we'll register their names in the family records tomorrow under Sarah and David's names." A cold, bitter rage surged through me. In my previous life, Mrs. Morrison's so-called support had been nothing but surveillance and criticism. The actual work, washing clothes, paying expenses, helping with homework, had fallen entirely on my shoulders. They had simply harvested the rewards of my labor without ever truly seeing me. Now, facing their unilateral decision again, I raised my voice. I refuse to raise them. If you register them under my name, I'll file for divorce immediately. Without waiting for their stunned reactions, I turned and walked out. I went straight to the village mailbox, where I discovered a letter addressed to me. Opening it, my eyes filled with tears. Inside was a crisp $100 bill and a bundle of precious food and fabric ration coupons, incredibly valuable during the scarcity of the 1980s. The letter came from Professor Chen, my parents' former university mentor who had always treated me like his own granddaughter. In my previous life, I only learned after the children had grown and entered Wellington University that he had been quietly supporting me for years. But the Morrisons had hidden everything from me. Hidden in the same mailbox, I found my Wellington University acceptance letter. In my past life, the Morrisons had concealed it to completely clip my wings. They wanted me to remain quietly with their family, working like an unpaid servant. I walked to the village entrance and approached Mrs. Kim, who ran the small general store. I asked to use her telephone to call one of my parents' old friends. Mrs. Kim had watched me grow up under the Morrison roof and understood the bitterness of living as someone's charity case. She didn't even accept the ration coupons I offered for the call, simply telling me to use the phone freely. When she had to step out for a delivery, she asked if I could watch the store. I gratefully accepted her kindness and silently vowed to repay her someday. Then I dialed the number I had memorized from this lifetime. After 3 rings, a deep, weathered but powerful voice answered. "Hello, who is this?" My throat constricted. "Professor Chen, it's me. It's Sarah." "Sarah, my dear child. You finally remembered this old man." Professor Chen sounded overjoyed. When I told him about my acceptance to Wellington University, his excitement was palpable. "Your parents, God rest their souls, would be so proud. They'd be absolutely thrilled to know how brilliantly you've succeeded." I explained my current situation and informed him I would be traveling to the capital in 3 days to prepare for the semester. When he heard what I had endured, his tone became grave and remorseful. He blamed himself for not protecting me properly all these years. But when I shared my decision to leave, he became fully supportive and insisted I stay with him once I reached the city. After ending the call, I released a long breath of relief. I carefully hid the letter and acceptance notice in a spot only I knew about. Just 3 more days, and I could finally change my destiny. When I returned to the Morrison house, most of the relatives had already departed. Only Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, David, and Rebecca Stone remained. Rebecca was still cradling one of the infants. I slipped in quietly, just in time to hear Rebecca speaking anxiously. "David, if Sarah won't raise them, what are we going to do?" David's voice was cold and determined. "She'll raise them whether she likes it or not. I'm shipping out to the army in a month, and you're starting college. Who else will take care of the children?" Mrs. Morrison chimed in supportively. "Don't worry, Rebecca. A child's mother should be someone educated and refined like you. Sarah grew up in our household, she wouldn't dare disobey us." Mr. Morrison puffed out his chest with patriarchal authority. "It's decided then. She doesn't get to make the rules in this house." All emotion had drained from me. In my previous life, whatever feelings I'd harbored had been slowly eroded by years of exhaustion and betrayal. I stepped into the room. All 4 of them turned toward me, surprised, each trying to read my expression and determine how much I had overheard. I looked directly at Rebecca. Perhaps out of guilt, she turned away and avoided my gaze. David positioned himself protectively in front of her and looked at me seriously. "This is my cousin Rebecca. She's been accepted to a teaching college and will be staying with us for the next month." I nodded wordlessly, pretending I hadn't heard their earlier conversation. Behind me, Mrs. Morrison quietly exhaled in relief. After dinner, I went straight to my room and began packing. I gathered everything that reminded me of David and set it aside separately. I didn't own many personal belongings, just 1 winter coat and a few light summer outfits. Compared to the thick wool coat Rebecca wore, my possessions weren't worth even half a yard of fabric. If I remembered correctly, Rebecca's coat had been made from the very fabric coupons Professor Chen had mailed to me. Though he sent generous amounts monthly, most had been intercepted by Mrs. Morrison. Very little ever reached me directly. They had raised me, yes, but they had done so using Professor Chen's money. In a way, they had already been compensated. As for Professor Chen, I would find a way to repay him every single cent. Then, for the first time in ages, David actually entered my room, without even knocking. He tossed a wool scarf onto my bed, speaking in a tone that felt more like charity than apology. "I've been neglecting you since we married. I brought this back from town for you." I glanced at the scarf. The pattern was nearly identical to Rebecca's coat. It must have been made from leftover scraps, yet he had gone out of his way to bring it back and present it to me like some grand gesture. David interpreted my silence as deep gratitude for the scarf, so he seized the opportunity to push further. "I'll be leaving for the army in a month. You need to pay closer attention to those 2 children. And remember, my parents raised us both. It wasn't easy. You should learn to be more considerate around the house. Do more chores. Wash dishes, clean clothes. Don't act like tonight, as if it's none of your business." I nearly laughed out loud. "Aren't you the one leaving in a month for the army? Why don't you share some of the household responsibilities with your parents before then?" David hesitated momentarily, then said, "Of course I'll do my part too." Just then, he noticed the notebook and woven bracelet he had once given me, now tucked away in the corner of my desk like forgotten trash. "What are these doing here?" he asked. I replied casually, "I was just cleaning up. What needs to be thrown away should be thrown away." His brow furrowed, and something inside him seemed to stir uncomfortably. He stepped toward my suitcase, looking as if he wanted to search through my belongings. Before I could stop him, a sweet, delicate voice called out, "David, there's no hot water left." He turned and quickly walked away, heading to the bathroom to heat water for Rebecca. He didn't return for the rest of the night. The next day, I didn't rise until noon. Mrs. Morrison didn't scold me for sleeping late. Instead, she was pacing around the main room, looking flustered and muttering, "How could it not be there? Where could it have gone? Did they decide not to send it this time?" Amused, I watched her from the doorway. I already knew exactly what she was searching for. "Mom," I said lightly, "what are you looking for?" She paused and studied me suspiciously, but convinced herself there was no way I could know anything about it. "It's nothing. The children are hungry. Go make them some formula." I smiled coldly. "David should do it. He's the one who will be gone in a month and won't see them again." Before she could launch into her usual performance, I turned and dashed out the door. I knew she had gone to the mailbox that morning and hadn't found the food coupons and money Professor Chen had sent me. Now she was panicking. In the past, they had secretly used all of it for the Morrison household, except for me. In my previous life, David had relied on that money to build connections and grease palms, eventually landing himself a decent position. With his smooth talking and well-timed flattery, he had climbed the ladder to become a department head 18 years later. And Rebecca's entire college tuition and expenses had basically come from my envelope too. They had enjoyed all the privileges I brought into their lives, yet believed it was perfectly justified, as if the world owed them such gifts without cost. I headed to the village youth center, which was filled with David's usual crowd, his rowdy, close-knit friends, and of course, Rebecca. Before I even got close, I heard one of his old buddies joking around, "Hey David, you really spoil Rebecca. How can you even bear to let her leave for college?" Rebecca was curled up in his arms, shy and bashful. "Stop talking nonsense. I just see David as an older brother." That only made the guy laugh louder. "Older brother? More like boyfriend." Everyone around them burst into laughter. The atmosphere was cheerful and light. David looked pleased, wrapping his arm around Rebecca. "Even after you go to the city, don't forget about me or the kids." Rebecca looked up at him, blushing, and planted a kiss on his cheek. "I won't." Then the topic shifted to me. David's expression turned more serious. Sarah's tough. She's the type who should stay home to take care of my parents and the kids. When it comes to talent and education, she's nothing compared to Rebecca. It felt like someone had driven a spike through my chest. Even though I already knew how heartless he could be, it still made me feel furious and humiliated. I thought about everything I had sacrificed in my past life. My education, my future, even my identity. 20 years of thankless effort. And this was all he had to say about me. Just then, a young woman entered from outside. She spotted me and looked surprised. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "Come in." The lively room instantly fell into awkward silence. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions stiff and unnatural. David and Rebecca jumped to their feet and stepped away from each other. Rebecca gave me a guilty look. "Sarah, you came without saying anything." David's eyes were sharp with annoyance. "Why aren't you at home watching the kids? What are you doing here?" I glanced at him and noticed the faint smear of lipstick on his cheek. A sarcastic smile tugged at my lips. Rebecca rushed to grab a tissue and awkwardly wiped David's cheek, trying to cover up the evidence. "Sarah, it's all my fault. David and I were just joking around." David looked guilty for a moment but quickly composed himself and replied righteously, "Rebecca and I grew up like siblings. There's nothing to hide." Perhaps worried I would call him out, his tone suddenly grew irritated. "Sarah, can you stop being so paranoid all the time? It's because of that attitude that I don't want to come home. You know, if only you had even a little of Rebecca's gentleness." "David," I cut him off. Only then did he seem to realize he had gone too far, and he finally shut his mouth. "The 2 kids you were so determined to adopt yesterday? They're hungry," I said calmly. "Your mom asked you to come home and make their formula." I finished my sentence as if I hadn't seen the embarrassed look on his face. But since I had clearly refused to adopt the kids yesterday, he couldn't refute anything I said. Left with no other choice, he followed me home. Rebecca bit her lip and came trailing behind. At dinner, Mr. Morrison informed me the kids have already been registered at the family hall. I nodded and said nothing. Mrs. Morrison gave David a meaningful look. "It's almost autumn, and Sarah's clothes are getting worn out. David, take her to the city in 2 days to buy some new ones." David looked at me and hesitated, stiffening slightly. Rebecca pouted, obviously unhappy. "Rebecca should come too," Mrs. Morrison added. "It's along the way anyway." She glanced at me. I nodded again, agreeing without objection. The whole family seemed surprised. After all, just a couple of days ago, I had openly embarrassed them in front of everyone. But in my mind, I was thinking, going to the city would be the perfect opportunity to buy a bus ticket out. I wouldn't even have to come up with an excuse. Perfect. "David, I could finally leave you. I had waited 2 lifetimes for this day." 2 days later, just before dawn, David gently pulled Rebecca out from under the covers and patiently helped her freshen up before coming to knock on my door. But I opened it before he could. He was clearly stunned when he saw me already dressed and packed. "Why are you carrying such a big bag?" he asked. I held my travel bag tightly and replied flatly, "Brought some food." Rebecca bounced up from behind him and frowned. "Sarah, we're going to the city, not farming in the fields." "Why bring food? They have food there, you know." David was annoyed too. "Fine, bring it if you want. Just don't complain halfway through and make me carry it." But nothing could shake my mood that day. "Don't worry," I said firmly. "I won't." We were riding in the village chief's pig transport truck. In this era, owning a truck was already a big deal. David gently helped Rebecca onto the truck and even laid down newspaper for her so she wouldn't dirty her clothes. I climbed up on my own, struggling, and found a random spot in a corner to sit. A woman from a neighboring village watched David and Rebecca's affectionate behavior and couldn't help but tease them. "Oh my, you 2 newlyweds. So close already." Your man is even more considerate than my old one ever was. Rebecca's face flushed with embarrassment, and David froze awkwardly, unsure how to respond. The village chief quickly jumped in to explain, "Ma'am, you've got it wrong. This is his wife," pointing to me. The woman turned and looked over at me sitting in the corner, her eyes full of confusion. She didn't say much more but mumbled under her breath, "I thought concubines were outlawed after the revolution. And yet here he is, flaunting his mistress while the wife sits in the corner." Her voice was soft, but everyone in the truck heard it loud and clear, especially Rebecca. Her face turned bright red, and she subtly pulled herself away from David's arms. David's expression was dark with embarrassment, and when no one was looking, he shot me a glare full of resentment. I ignored the entire farce. All I could think about was tightly clutching the bag in my hand. It held all my hopes. Once we got off the truck and the crowd began to scatter, David looked at me with increasing impatience. His tone was cold as he said, "Here's $5. Go buy yourself some clothes. Be back here at 3 p.m. sharp." With that, he threw the crumpled $5 bill into my arms without a second glance and walked away with Rebecca by his side. Before she left, Rebecca turned back and gave me a look full of pity. I bent down, picked up the money, and tucked it into my pocket. I knew perfectly well that Mrs. Morrison had given David $50, but in his eyes, I was only worth $5. It didn't matter anymore. I had already told Professor Chen that he didn't need to send any more money. The money he had sent before would be enough to sever all ties between us. I turned and headed toward the station. And when I finally boarded that train to the capital, tears that I had held back for decades began to fall. After wasting away so many years in that village, I had never even imagined there could be another kind of life for me. I was sent to live with the Morrisons when I was 5, and the man I spent the most time around was David. Inevitably, I fell in love with him. But to him, I was just a little sister, a housemaid, a tool, never a wife. That love I held onto for more than 10 years? Maybe it was never real love. Maybe it was just an obsession. If my parents could see me from heaven, see how I spent my past life revolving around a man and his family, they would probably be heartbroken. But it's okay. I'm grateful to the heavens for giving me a second chance. Maybe it was my parents up there who couldn't bear to see me suffer anymore, who wished for me to be reborn. I hoped this time my life would shine brightly. When I arrived in the capital, I first went to the central hospital and submitted several strands of hair for a paternity test. After that, I followed an address to Professor Chen's home. It had been many years since I had last set foot in the capital. Standing in front of the solemn and imposing Chen residence, I couldn't help but feel a bit timid and uneasy. But when the young housemaid saw me, she looked delighted. "You must be Miss Sarah, right? The old master told us you'd be arriving in the next few days. Please come in. He's just playing chess now." I nodded and stood at the door, stomping my shoes several times to knock off the dried mud before stepping into the Chen household. The house was even quieter than I remembered. In the large living room, 2 elderly gentlemen were seated at a chessboard. When Professor Chen saw me, he slammed a chess piece down, scattering the board, and immediately grabbed his cane to come meet me. Behind him, the other gentleman shouted, "Chen, you cheating rascal." But Professor Chen's eyes were brimming with tears. He looked me up and down and said, "Good girl, you've been through so much." Just those few simple words were enough to soothe the decades of pain buried in my heart. I stepped forward and hugged him. Tears streamed down my face, bittersweet but full of new hope. I told Professor Chen everything about what had happened in the countryside. The more he listened, the angrier he became. The other elderly gentleman next to him also looked serious. "Child, leave it to me," he said. "That marriage, even if he doesn't want a divorce, he's getting one. This is a new society. Women in our country aren't meant to be mistreated." Only then did Professor Chen introduce him to me, Professor Wang, one of his closest friends. According to Professor Chen, Professor Wang's wife worked for the Women's Federation. When she heard about my situation, she was heartbroken. Without hesitation, she filed an application with the authorities to initiate a forced divorce on my behalf. When she learned that I had been accepted into Wellington University, Professor Wang looked at me with even more admiration. Before I left, he gave me a meaningful reminder: focus on your studies. It wasn't until later that Professor Chen told me Professor Wang was a senior professor in the chemistry department at Wellington, ironically, the very subject I wanted to study in this life. Classes wouldn't begin for another month, and under Professor Chen's warm insistence, I stayed at the Chen home. I had worried that other members of his family might object, but to my surprise, everyone in the Chen family was just as kind-hearted as he was. He had 2 sons and a daughter, all of whom were already married. After school, their children would fill the house with laughter and chatter. Uncle Li and Uncle Wang chatted with me about my academic plans, while Aunt Jeanne pulled me into her arms with such tenderness it made my heart ache. Since my parents passed away, I hadn't felt this kind of warmth in so long, and I vowed to repay the kindness of the entire Chen family. Every day, I helped tutor Professor Chen's grandchildren with their studies. Time passed quickly, and before I knew it, the first day of school had arrived. I said goodbye to Professor Chen and decided to move into the dorms at Wellington. At his request, I promised to come back every week for a family dinner. Before leaving for the dorm, I mailed out 2 copies of the paternity test results and a letter. What I didn't know was that my departure had already caused chaos back in the Morrison household. When David and Rebecca returned to the village, they didn't even notice I wasn't in the truck. In their eyes, they only had each other. Why would they care whether I had gotten on or not? It wasn't until both kids had soiled their beds and Mrs. Morrison started yelling for me to come clean it up that someone finally realized I was missing. There was no answer. David finally remembered he had left me behind in the city. Mrs. Morrison told him to hurry back and find me, but David brushed it off, thinking she was overreacting. She's not a kid anymore. It's not like she can't find her way home. Then he turned right back to sweet-talking Rebecca, ignoring the crying children. Rebecca did feel bad for the kids, but the awful smell was enough to make someone like her, who had never lifted a finger in her life, back away in disgust. In the end, it was Mrs. Morrison who had to clean everything up, cursing my name under her breath the whole time, vowing that if I dared come back, she would teach me a lesson. But after 4 or 5 days with no sign of me, the whole family began to realize something was wrong. David borrowed the village chief's truck again and went back to the city to look for me. When the village chief asked where I was, David stammered, saying I had gone to visit a cousin in the city. The chief was suspicious. After all, he knew I had been adopted, and there was no cousin to speak of. When they arrived in the county, David dragged some of his fellow army recruits to help him search. They looked from sunrise to sunset, asked everyone they could, but found no trace of me. David took a deep breath. He had never expected me to cause him this much trouble. Furious but holding it in, he continued the search. Only one older woman at the ticket booth seemed to recognize the description. You mean the young girl in the yellow blouse with the ponytail? About this much taller than me? She asked, gesturing with her hand. David lit up. Yes, that's her. Do you know where she went? The woman smiled. She took a train to the capital. Said she was going to college. It hit David like a thunderclap. I went to the capital for college? What about their home? Their family? David stumbled back home in a daze. Mrs. Morrison rushed to him. David, still stunned, exploded in frustration when he saw her. Mom, why didn't you tell me Sarah got into college? She's gone to the capital. She's never coming back. Mrs. Morrison's face turned ghostly pale. Mr. Morrison dropped his pipe. It hit the floor and snapped clean in half. Rebecca came out from the bedroom, holding one of the kids, her face full of shock. Mrs. Morrison slumped into a chair, completely drained. It's my fault. I should have hidden her identification papers. I should have known she wanted to run. Then she seemed to realize something. She hadn't received any money or ration coupons that month. She must have gone to the Chen family in the capital. Let's go get her back. She was born a Morrison. She'll die a Morrison. The Chen family has no right to take away our daughter-in-law. Mr. Morrison picked up the broken pipe and wiped it carefully with his shirt. His expression was calm, but his voice carried authority. Yes, we need to bring her back. He glanced at the child in Rebecca's arms. Otherwise, who's going to raise my grandchildren? Only then did David remember that both he and Rebecca were supposed to leave the village in a month. Neither of them could afford to let the children get in the way of their futures. So he nodded and decided to go to the city with the village chief in 2 days to buy a ticket to the capital. That night, Rebecca lay on the edge of the bed, thoughts racing. She rolled over and said to David, "I didn't expect Sarah got into college too. I wonder which one it is." David, irritated, replied, "What kind of college could she possibly get into? Probably just a vocational school or something." Then he paused, as if ashamed to even admit she was his wife. His eyes turned to Rebecca like she was some rare treasure. "No matter what school she got into, she'll never compare to you. For someone like her, going to school is a waste of money. You, on the other hand, have a bright future." Rebecca smirked smugly, clearly satisfied with his answer. Back then, getting into college was already incredibly rare, let alone a teaching university in the capital. People from all over the neighboring towns were envious, praising David like he was something special. But while David was still dreaming about dragging me back, the village chief brought devastating news. The very next day, I had mailed a legally binding forced divorce order from the capital. When she heard the news, Mrs. Morrison nearly fainted. Mr. Morrison, usually calm and composed, completely lost his temper and shouted, "Unbelievable! This is outrageous!" David's mind went blank. He turned to the village chief, hoping for help. But the chief just shook his head. "David, this is an official order. I don't have the authority to intervene. What's done is done. From what I hear, Sarah got into Wellington University. You all better not go bothering her anymore." Even the village chief had been shocked when he received the document. Though he had seen plenty of official paperwork in his time, this was the first time he had encountered a forced divorce order issued by the Women's Federation. He and the other village officials had studied it carefully and realized it wasn't a discussion, it was a declaration. The document formally stated that Sarah Morrison and David Morrison were no longer husband and wife, and that both were now free to marry as they pleased. Attached was also a full report of all the money and ration tickets the Chen family had sent over the years. The total was staggering. Even the village chief was stunned. The Morrison family is insatiable, he thought. That amount of money could have raised 10 girls like me with the best care. Even my tuition and school fees had been covered. Clearly, the Chen family had placed high hopes in me. Yet the Morrisons had forced me to drop out and marry David early on. And ever since, they had treated me with disdain. Nothing I did was ever good enough. People in the village had seen everything, what I wore, how hard I worked. Just by looking at the oily hair and bloated faces of Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, everyone knew exactly where the money had gone. Fortunately, I had persevered and gotten into Wellington University entirely through my own efforts, a top-tier school, all through self-study. Under the village chief's firm gaze, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison looked extremely uncomfortable. He didn't stay long. After handing over the papers, he left, leaving the Morrison family embarrassed and stunned in their own living room. "She's really not coming back?" Mrs. Morrison asked weakly, her voice still carrying a sliver of hope. David felt like something had been ripped out of him. His chest was hollow. For the first time, he realized what it meant to lose something real. Rebecca sat nearby, utterly speechless. She had never imagined someone like me could actually get into a top-tier university like Wellington. Just days ago, she had flaunted herself in front of me, and I had said nothing at the time, but may well have been secretly laughing at her. Meanwhile, I walked out of the lab with my senior, Michael Wang, still discussing the chemical formulas from our latest experiment. Suddenly, a female classmate came running toward me, looking anxious. "Sarah, someone's waiting for you at the school gate." They said something happened at home. My heart dropped. Did something happen to Professor Chen? I hurriedly said goodbye to Michael and rushed toward the gate. Before I even got there, I heard a voice shouting, "I came to get my wife." "Who are you to stop me?" It was David's voice. The moment he saw me, his face lit up. "Sarah, let's go home. My parents are sick." I looked at him expressionlessly. If Mr. and Mrs. Morrison are sick, they should see a doctor. Besides, Rebecca can take care of them. "Why are you here for me?" David flinched at how I addressed his parents but still forced a smile. "Sarah, I know you hold a grudge against us, but think about how my parents raised you. Isn't it time to let go of that anger? After all, a daughter-in-law should care for her in-laws. You may have gotten into Wellington, but that doesn't mean you can be ungrateful." His words caused some of the students nearby who had already gathered out of curiosity to glance at me, their expressions uncertain. But this was a university, and these were educated people. No one rushed to judge without knowing the full story. Just then, Rebecca finally stepped out from wherever she had been hiding. Her voice trembled as she tried to twist the situation. "Sarah, I know you're jealous of how close David and I are, but we're cousins. How could you abandon your own children and in-laws like this? Don't you know how much the kids miss their mom?" As soon as she finished speaking, Rebecca picked up the two scruffy-looking children from the rickshaw. They were wailing at the top of their lungs. Rebecca set the poor kids down right in front of everyone, putting them on display. That was when the crowd around us started to waver. "Sarah, if what they're saying is true, maybe you really should go back and take care of your family. Yeah, the kids are innocent. Since you gave birth to them, you should raise them too. Education is important, sure, but you should also value the people right in front of you. That guy still looks like he really loves you." I gave a cold, silent smile. I didn't bother arguing with my classmates. I knew they were being manipulated, but public opinion, it wasn't something only David could influence. I turned and looked at him. "David, did your unit kick you out? Is that why you suddenly have time to come all the way here and cause trouble?"